have an interesting lecture for you today, one that I personally look forward to every year. I'm extremely lucky to have as my colleague Professor Steve Bittner. I could make him mad and call him Professor Steve Bittner, but he generally, I think, likes to be called Steve. He grew up in Michigan in a small town that I visited when I was young, so we have a common interest in the shores of Lake Michigan. He's got his BA in history, was it in history? Yeah. In history from the University of Michigan. He's got an obsession, like most people I know who have anything to do with the University of Michigan, with their sports teams. That's a joke.
They're all Ohio State fans.
Oh.
That was supposed to be a joke.
He's got his Ph.D. in Russian history from the University of Chicago, which is very well known for its Russian history department. Most prestigious. He's written two books. The first one is The Many Lives of Khrushchev's Thaw, and he spent a lot of time in archives looking through papers that had been written in a secretive way. And the second one is about a Kremlin scholar named Dmitry Shepelov. How many history majors are there? Well, don't be proud. Who was a high-ranking official in the Soviet Communist Party. And as I have been want to think about and dream about, especially since I have grandparents who were Russian and who lived in the area that Steve is studying recently. He is studying the history of winemaking along the Black Sea, particularly in Georgia and the Crimea. And my grandparents were from that area before they migrated to the United States. So Steve and I have a great deal to talk about, but we rarely see each other. I was on sabbatical, and so was he. But without ado, I present to you Dr. Steve Bittner.
Okay, I love the fact that we're right next to the music classrooms, or practice rooms. And those of you who've had me before, you probably know I play the piano. So if I hear Chopin's First Nocturne or the Revolutionary Etude, written to commemorate the Polish uprising against the Russians in 1831, I will have to stop and listen. Okay. I always start this lecture with some disclosures. By almost any standard, I am the least accomplished speaker that you will see this semester. This lecture series really attracts some of the brightest stars in the field of Holocaust studies and the history of the Holocaust in particular. And one of the reasons why I really love it and participate in it every year is that it reminds me of what my own undergraduate life was like. I went to the University of Michigan, as Mirna said, big state public research university with all the assets of a big public research university. And this reminds me a lot of what I remember from Michigan. And it's the sort of thing you would find in a place like Berkeley or UCLA. So I think it's really a feather in SSU's cap that we have that here as well. So that's my first disclosure. My second disclosure is that I'm not a historian of Germany, or really even of the Holocaust. I'm a historian of the Soviet Union. So I'm an outsider to this field, and that's actually quite convenient, because what it means if I'm asked a hard question, I can deflect it to Myrna or to the other experts in the room. But of course, that doesn't mean I haven't thought about the Holocaust. Because in truth, there's a great deal of theoretical overlap in the scholarship on Nazism and Stalinism. And they tend to be joined by this concept of totalitarianism, which we talk about a lot in my Soviet history classes. And unfortunately, totalitarianism is a word which is so overused that it has become almost devoid of meaning. It's like the word terror or terrorism. But 50 years ago, two Harvard political scientists, a man named Carl Friedrich and Zbigniew Brzezinski, used it to refer to regimes like the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany that had totalizing ambitions. That is, that they sought to control not only actions that occurred in public, but also what occurred in private. Now, Stalinism and Nazism are also linked with the concept of genocide. Albeit less frequently, and in my mind, less satisfactorily, because I don't think the Soviet Union was ever genocidal. At least it never intended to commit genocide. And I say that, you should understand that I'm no apologist for the Soviet regime. I fully understand how repressive it was. And by the way, this comparison between Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia is one, I think, where the Soviet Union, Stalinist Russia, comes out looking pretty good. And it speaks to one of the great ironies of 20th century world history. And that is that the Soviet Union, a communist country, saved the capitalist world from its own excesses by defeating Nazi Germany in the Second World War. And this is something, too, that we talk about in my Soviet history class. The Soviet Union, by any standard of measurement, was the principal victor of the Second World War. It is also true that the Holocaust was primarily an Eastern European and a Soviet event. And our image of the Holocaust in the United States tends to be one of Vichy collaborators in France and Anne Frank holed up in her attic in Amsterdam. But the truth is that the vast majority of people who perished in the Holocaust resided in the East. In fact, if we include lands that were partitioned by the Soviet Union in 1939, this is basically parts of Romania, much of Poland, about half of the victims of the Holocaust were Soviet citizens. Okay, so that's half of 6 million were Soviet citizens. And this is because the heartland of European Jewry, the lands that comprise the old Pale of settlement in Ukraine and Belarusia, were left almost completely devoid of Jews by the end of the war. And I'll talk a little bit about what this Pale of settlement was today. So I think that's what qualifies me to think, or to think and to speak about the Holocaust. I'm an outsider, but in truth my field is not very far distant from the field of Holocaust studies. Now, if I asked you what the Holocaust was, I am sure that nearly all of you could answer, right? You would say something like the Holocaust was the event whereby German soldiers and political leaders and bureaucrats and their non-German abettors planned and implemented the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and smaller numbers of Roma. What are the Roma? Gypsies, yeah, good. Slavs, handicapped persons, homosexuals, and communists. Now, as such, the Holocaust is the central event in all of German history. It is, I think, the central event in modern European history. That is, it's the most important event in modern European history since the French Revolution. It colors our understanding of what it means to be German and what it means to be European. And it forces us to rethink events as pivotal as the Enlightenment. So what is the Enlightenment?
philosophers began thinking of the world in terms of a more scientific approach and veered away from the religious aspects that were so commonly practiced. Religion was a large part of everyone's life. And they looked at the world and how it worked through a religious perspective. And
Okay.
So
And do you want to put some dates on that?
1640?
Yeah, oh, perfect. So yeah, it begins middle of the 17th century. I was going to say 1650, but the truth is there is no certain beginning, right? It's not like people woke up and said, the Enlightenment, let's go. So it begins sometime in the middle of the 17th century, and then I think we can say it ends with the American and French revolutions, right? So 1776 and 1789 are good end dates. And it is this philosophic and political awakening when philosophers and enlightened political leaders like Frederick the Great and Catherine the Great tried to apply rational scientific law to the realm of politics. The Enlightenment produced the French Revolution, produced the American Revolution. We are a thoroughly enlightened regime. But more important, it gave us the idea, which no doubt many of you subscribe to, but has proven awful dangerous in practice. The idea that human existence can be improved and even perfected. Okay, so remember that. The Enlightenment gives us this idea that human existence can be improved and perfected. Now, if I asked you why the Holocaust happened, I suspect you would find it much more difficult to answer. Why, after all, did hundreds of thousands of seemingly normal, intelligent, and otherwise moral Germans participate in mass murder? And then why did millions of their countrymen do nothing to stop it? Now, as the historian Daniel Jonah Goldhagen pointed out a few years ago, your answer to that question, why the Holocaust happened, would probably have as much to do with the nature of human existence, what Joseph Conrad famously called the heart of darkness that resides in all of us, than with the individual motivations of persons who participated in mass murder. And I'm not so naive as to think that we will be able to answer this question today. In fact, I'm fairly confident that we will still be debating this question at SSU in 100 years. It is one of those interminable debates. But today I do want to provide you with some conceptual tools that you can use this semester in this class to begin to try to answer that question yourself. And so I'm going to identify three structural developments that, in my mind, facilitated the Holocaust, and then move on to the specific circumstances in which the Nazis came to power. And then I will conclude with some thoughts on the ways that historians have tried to make sense of the Holocaust, the ways they've tried to explain the Holocaust. Okay? So let's start with my first structural factor that facilitated the Holocaust. And I'm going to call this anti-Semitism. Despite the fact that a previous speaker in this series, in fact, one of the most eminent speakers ever to participate in this series, Yehuda Bauer, has called anti-Semitism a stupid term. And that's because there is no doctrine of Semitism to be opposed to, right? The ISM suffix always means doctrine. It's a frequent New York Times crossword puzzle clue. Nonetheless, in its common usage, anti-Semitism refers to animosity toward Jews. But interestingly, not towards other Semitic peoples, like Arabs. It refers to animosity towards Jews. Now, in some forms, anti-Semitism is as old as Christianity itself. Many verses in the New Testament strike the modern reader as anti-Semitic. And there's a reason for this. There was probably tension in the early Christian movement between Jews who accepted the new religion and Jews who did not. But much of Christian anti-Semitism, of course, hinges on one idea in particular, and that is that Jews were responsible for the death of Christ. According to the book of John, Pontius Pilate, who was the Roman governor in Jerusalem, was ready to pardon Christ but was convinced otherwise by a hostile Jewish crowd, a bloodthirsty Jewish crowd. According to the book of Matthew, Caiaphas, who was the Jewish high priest in Jerusalem, helped fabricate evidence against Jesus. And actually, this is what got Mel Gibson in trouble, right, with his movie The Passion. And in fairness to the author of the book of Matthew, a fuller reading suggests that Caiaphas wanted to stave off a Roman military incursion. So you sacrifice one man in order to save many. Nonetheless, as a result of this, until the 20th century, it was accepted doctrine in the Roman Catholic Church that Jews were responsible for the death of Christ. And this alone was often a reason for popular animosity toward Jews. So when the plague hit Europe in the middle of the 14th century, there were persistent rumors that it was caused by Jews who had poisoned the water. There were also rumors that lasted well into the 20th century that Jews used the blood of Christian children in their Passover matzahs. Anybody know what a matzah is? Yeah, what is it? Yeah, unleavened bread. I have to say, it's not one of the greater Jewish contributions to world cuisine. When I was in college, we used them as Frisbees. Along with Muslims, Jews were targeted by the Crusades in the 11th through the 13th centuries. They were objects of the Inquisition. In the 12th and 13th centuries, they were repeatedly expelled from France. They were expelled from Spain in 1492. They were expelled from Prussia in the 1700s. And in the Russian Empire, where many displaced Jews moved, they were confined to territories that were called the Pale of Settlement. And the Pale of Settlement coincided with what is today central and western Ukraine, Belarusia, and even the southern part of Lithuania. And much of Poland as well. In large parts of Eastern Europe, Jews were forbidden from owning land, and this gives us the most pernicious of Jewish stereotypes, right? That is the Jewish merchant and the Jewish money changer. And of course, there's a little bit of truth in every stereotype, right? And the reason this stereotype exists is that was the only way Jews could make a living in much of Europe. Unexpected or unexplainable tragedies frequently resulted in pogroms. It's actually a Russian word. Translated directly, it means a little storm, a little popular uprising. So anti-Semitism has been with us for a very long time. But that doesn't mean that anti-Semitism is not changing or has not changed. And over the course of the 19th century, anti-Semitism changed in important ways. Generally speaking, it became less religious and more racial in orientation. And this reflected two important developments in the lives of European Jews. First of all, Jews were increasingly urban. Right? So they moved out of the shtetl, these little Jewish villages, much of the Pale of Settlement, and they moved into cities, like Warsaw, and even with increasing frequency to places like Moscow and St. Petersburg. Many were no longer practicing. That is, they were lapsed Jews. Right? And this meant that men did not wear the beards and the yarmulke. In the Russian Empire, movement in and out of the Pale of Settlement was tolerated. So it became increasingly difficult to identify who was Jewish and who was not. Now, the switch from religious to racial anti-Semitism also reflected various pseudo-scientific theories that were in vogue in the 19th century. And these theories invariably attributed defining physical and mental characteristics to ethnic and racial groups. And whether or not you want to admit it, you have all heard these stereotypes, right? Englishmen are individualistic, Germans were punctual, Irishmen were drunkards, Frenchmen were good lovers, right? How were Americans perceived? Anybody know? spending at least a month every year in Europe, I can say unfortunately that we're perceived as the fat people. Oh, and I have a slide here, so I will. What do I point this at? Okay. Oh, so here, this is obviously from the 20th century, the 1930s. But here you see this sort of this racial science being taught in a German school. And here this little boy is being shown what the characteristics of the Aryans are and what the characteristics of the lesser races are. Now, Jews, unfortunately, were associated with less savory characteristics. They were thought to be greedy and rootless and cosmopolitan. And this word cosmopolitan, it actually meant the same thing then as it does now. It means worldly, right, or sophisticated in outlook. But the values were reversed, right? Cosmopolitanism suggested that Jews had little loyalty for the nation, but instead pledged their allegiance to various transnational groups like the Jewish diaspora, that is Jews who lived in many different places, or to political movements like Zionism, which I'll talk about in a bit, or even communism. Now, if you've been following or paying attention closely, you see that there is a contradiction here. Jews are simultaneously being associated with greed and with communism. Right? Is there such a thing as a greedy communist? That seems oxymoronic, right? But this is what the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman calls the viscosity of Jewish identity. Jewish identity, as perceived by anti-Semites, was always slippery. Right? Viscosity is the measure of the slipperiness of a lubricant. So Jews can be arch-capitalists 1 minute, greedy in the extreme, or they can be conniving, atheistic Bolsheviks, determined to destroy the capitalist order. Now, this is hardly an exhaustive list of all the indignities that Jews were subjected to, and it's not meant to be one. But I do want to underscore a point that the historian Jan Gross makes in his study of the Holocaust in the Polish city or Polish village, really, of Jedwabne. And that is, Gross points out that prior to the Holocaust, anti-Semitism from the perspective of Jews was a lot like an intractable, low-intensity war. So Jews, particularly in the eastern part of Europe, had to be savvy to survive. A moment's carelessness, an insult, could lead to a pogrom. But the point is that a low-intensity war is survivable. In all but a few extraordinary cases, the Holocaust was not survivable. Okay, so I'm going to move on now to my second structural characteristic that contributed to the Holocaust, and that is nationalism. So we have some words here that we have to define. And so what is a nation? And feel free to lend your expertise here. Yeah.
It's a group of people with a common heritage, common religion, common history, common ancestors, common language.
That's right. It's a group of people that share some affinity, right? And that affinity can be culture, it can be religion, it can be ethnicity, it can be some combination of the above, but they imagine themselves as distinct, right, from other people outside the nation. So then what is nationalism? Yeah?
It's like loyalty to that nation and to the people that you share that nation with.
Yeah, loyalty. So what's the difference between nationalism and patriotism?
It's like kind of the same thing, but it's like loyalty to everything that's like within that border and like the culture that you share with everyone else.
Okay. Okay, and it's Brad, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think patriotism incorporates a sense of pride.
And nationalism?
It's more of a duty.
Duty. Okay. this a lot, and the difficulty of defining something like nationalism is we get a definition that works in some cases, but not all cases. And so I think I've come up with something that works in just about every imaginable scenario. And that is that nationalism is a doctrine that says that each nation deserves its state, its own state. Okay? So in other words, each of these groups that we have just defined as a nation, according to nationalism, deserves its own state. Now, despite what nationalists say, nationalists often locate the origins of their nations in the very distant past. Nations are, for the most part, relatively recent phenomena in world history. Even the oldest nations have only existed for a little more than 200 years. Many of the nations in Eastern Europe are a good deal younger than this. In Western Europe, the signal event for early nationalists was the French Revolution. And the French Revolution is significant because it locates political sovereignty in a broad citizenry, right, instead of a narrow aristocracy or a royal family. But in Central and Eastern Europe, where territories were incorporated into multinational empires or petty principalities, nationalism was shaped by something different. And that is by this cultural movement that we call Romanticism. There's Romanticism with a big R, not a little r. So here, another full disclosure, my aunt is actually a very accomplished romance writer, F. Roseanne Bittner. I don't know, has anybody read F. Roseanne Bittner? You see, like, her books at the checkout lane at the supermarket with Fabio with his shirt off. Man, I chose the wrong career. Not that I want to be Fabio, I want to be the writer. So in its broadest sense, Romanticism refers to a movement of art, thought, and cultural sensibility in which feeling and imagination are emphasized instead of science and rationality. And this reflects the origins of Romanticism. Romanticism comes out of a period in European history that we call the Counter-Enlightenment. Right? And the Counter-Enlightenment comes on the heels of the Enlightenment. So it really begins in the wake of the French Revolution. The Counter-Enlightenment, and Romanticism in particular, was a reaction to the growing confidence that characterized the world of the Enlightenment. For instance, by the 1750s, the notion of historical progress, that is that the present is better than the past and the future will be better yet. This is an awful seductive idea. I'm sure that many of us subscribe to it. This positivistic view of history was firmly entrenched in Europe. The French and the American revolutions, insofar as they promised the emancipation of all men, marked the political culmination of this historical positivism. So Romantics were skeptical about this. Now, Romanticism expressed a deep anxiety about the extent and pace of social and cultural change that was occurring in Europe. Romanticism was skeptical of science. And of course, the greatest example of Romantic literature, Romantic with the big R's, is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Right? Romantics were skeptical of the claim that man had mastered the secrets of nature. Romantics were interested instead in the sense of vulnerability and anxiety that beset the modern man. So who were these Romantics? Well, I'll mention just one. I mentioned I played the piano. So the composer Richard Wagner was prominent among Romantics. Anybody know Wagner's music? Yeah, so Wagner, he's probably an anti-Semite, but he wrote music which is absolutely ethereal. In his composition, he celebrated folk culture as really the only constant in this world that was being torn asunder by social and cultural change. And so in folk culture, Wagner located the kernel of the authentic national soul. So in other words, if you wanted to discover what it meant to be German, you went to the countryside and visited with peasants. You didn't look in Berlin or in Hamburg. And insofar as nations existed, it was because they shared in this cultural patrimony, the cultural patrimony of folk culture. Now, of course, the irony here is that Richard Wagner was a cosmopolitan polyglot, right? He spoke many different languages. Personally, he probably found peasants to be quite detestable, even though he idolized their lives. Now, as a political doctrine, nationalism was and remains one of the most successful of all time. Over the course of 100 years, Europe ceased to be a continent of empires, and it became a continent of nation states, right? That is the fruit of nationalism. So states that base their legitimacy on the will of the nation. And I'm going to read through a quick list here of the nation states that come into existence. I'm going to go too fast for you to write this all down. It's more important to know that this is what happens. So Serbia comes into existence in 1815. Greece in 1829. Romania in 1859. Italy in 1861. Germany in 1871. Bulgaria in 1878. Albania in 1912. And then a whole long list of nations that emerge from the ashes of the First World War. Czechoslovakia, that's a little unusual because it actually comprises two nations, right? The Czechs and the Slovaks. Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Hungary, Ukraine, all date their emergence to the year 1918. And then finally, Turkey becomes a nation state in 1923. But nationalism also caused problems. The borders that were drawn between nation states were rarely perfect. Romanians lived in Russia, Ukrainians lived in Poland, Germans lived in Czechoslovakia, Turks lived in Bulgaria, and so on and so on. Millions of Europeans lived outside of their titular nation state. And then there were the Jews, who had a nationalist ideology, Zionism, but no nation state of their own. And you should have gotten a handout, and I realize since my predecessor at Sonoma State is here, he's actually the one who collected these figures on the national composition of Eastern Europe. Steve Watrous in the back row there. It's just proof that any great idea I've had, I've actually borrowed from somebody else. So those figures were actually compiled by Professor Watrous. But nonetheless, they should give you some sense about how cluttered the borders were. Right? There were lots of people who lived outside of their titular nation states, particularly Jews, since they lacked a nation state altogether. Okay, my third structural characteristic that facilitated the Holocaust, I'm going to call militarism. After 1870, every major European power maintained a standing army, that is an army that existed even in peacetime. They spent increasing sums of money on weapons production. Military spending doubled in France between 1875 and 1914. It tripled in Britain and Germany over the same period. And in Russia, by 1914, the military accounted for a full 1/3 of the total state budget. Now, as a point of comparison, we of course have to look at present-day America. Military spending in the United States today is about half of the discretionary budget, which is about half of the overall budget. So that means it's about a quarter. So relatively speaking, they're spending more in Russia in 1914. On the eve of the First World War, there were some 19 million men in uniform in Europe. And military thinking and military values had begun to pervade European society. Technology also spurred this arms race on. The French introduced a machine gun in the 1860s. New industrial processes made possible the development of far larger and more accurate artillery pieces. By the beginning of the First World War, the Germans had artillery pieces that could launch a shell 75 miles. Iron bottoms, that is, or ships whose hulls are built from iron, revolutionized naval warfare. By the early 1900s, a new vessel of unprecedented size was in use. The British call it the dreadnought. We call it the battleship. It's basically a floating artillery platform. And then even more ominously, nations began to experiment with chemical weapons. And then, of course, the First World War witnessed the widespread use of chemical arms. But more important, the very idea of violence had become socially and culturally acceptable. So people of all political persuasions, from social Darwinists on the right to Marxists on the left to liberals in the middle, they all thought that struggle between peoples was historically necessary. And the accepted form of patriotic expression became jingoism. This is an interesting word, jingoism. It refers to a very belligerent form of nationalism or patriotism. And this enthusiasm for violence was manifested in extremely low desertion rates, at least on the Western Front, during the First World War. For instance, the French command anticipated that desertion rates would be somewhere between 5 and 13%, right? Because French soldiers could just walk home if they got tired of fighting. In reality, the desertion rate proved to be 1.5%. And that suggests that even the soldiers buy into the necessity of the violence. And let me say, if there ever was a senseless war, it was the First World War. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to the specific circumstances under which the Nazis came to power. Nazi success built upon the failures of German liberalism. Right, and this term liberalism, it probably means something different in this context than what you understand it to be. Liberalism refers to basically regimes that embrace the values of the Enlightenment, right? So the free market, civil rights, so on and so on. Interestingly, in our politics, the party on the right is probably the most direct descendant of classical European liberalism. So Nazi success built upon the failures of German liberalism, in particular the failures of what was called the Weimar Republic. And Weimar was the city in Eastern Germany where the new German constitution was drafted after Germany's capitulation in the First World War. The Weimar Republic lasted until 1933, and during this period it was probably the world's most democratic state. But it also had many, many weaknesses. And of course the one that everybody comments on are the onerous reparations of the Treaty of Versailles, right? The reparations that Britain and France, despite the unwillingness of their American partners, levied on the defeated Germans. To some extent, I'm inclined to think that the importance of these are overstated. I think it's more important that the new civilian leadership in Germany had to agree to the reparations. And so they were immediately saddled with the shame of defeat. Equally important was the political polarization that characterized the Weimar. For instance, on November 9th, 1918, the day that German liberals proclaimed the formation of the Weimar Republic, German socialists proclaimed the formation of a pro-Soviet socialist republic. And for a short time, the fate of Germany actually hung in the balance. It wasn't clear which way Germany was going to turn. Was it going to turn towards the capitalist democracies in the West or to the socialist power to its east? There were right-wing uprisings in 1920 and 1923 in the Weimar Republic. And then, in 1929, the American economy slipped into recession. In October of 1929, the New York Stock Exchange tanked. Europe collapsed within weeks. After the crash, American financiers were no longer able to continue infusing capital into the European economies. By 1932, American investment in Europe had fallen by 70% on the 1928 figure. And this was particularly brutal for Germany because Germany needed American loans to pay its war indemnity, its war reparations. So it's not surprising, I guess, that Germany was the first state to experience political upheaval on account of the economic turmoil. In parliamentary elections in September of 1930, German voters stunned the pundits by handing 107 of the 611 seats in the German parliament to the National Socialist Party, the Nazis. So overnight, and seemingly without any warning at all, the Nazis, as they were called, went from being an inconsequential party to comprising the second largest bloc in the Reichstag, second largest to the Social Democrats. So it seems that the Nazis were the prime beneficiaries of Germany's mounting economic crisis. Now, we know, of course, the Nazis were led by Adolf Hitler. Hitler was born in Austria in 1889. As a young man, he dabbled as a painter and unfortunately was denied admission to the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. Someone a couple years ago actually staged an exhibition of Hitler's paintings, which raises all sorts of interesting counterfactual questions. What if he had been accepted into the Academy of Fine Arts? Hitler served with the German infantry in the First World War, and he twice received the Iron Cross for surviving poison gas attacks. After the war, Hitler joined the Nazi Party. He was not the founder. He joined it. And Nazi, of course, means National Socialist. Socialist here requires a little bit of explanation. It's not intended to be understood in the Marxist sense. Rather, it refers to the feeling of solidarity that supposedly existed among German veterans of the First World War. In 1923, Hitler was arrested for participating in a coup against the Bavarian government in Munich. The coup plotters were caught before any serious harm could be done, but Hitler was sentenced to 9 months in prison. And while he was in prison, he wrote the book that would become the Bible of the Nazi movement, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. And in this book, Hitler laid out his view of history. And he, to some extent, he was writing in response to Marx. Right? So Marx argues that class struggle is the engine of history. It's what pushes history along. Hitler argued instead that history was driven by a struggle between the races. Okay? So the master race, Hitler called the Aryans, and the Aryans included not only the Germans, but also the English people, were ordained by God to be the implacable foe of lesser races. Hitler had in mind particularly the Jews and the Slavs. Now, according to Hitler, Germany had to adopt an aggressive foreign policy in order to achieve its historical destiny, right, to triumph over these lesser races. He thought that the German army had to conquer essential Lebensraum, living space in the East. Hitler knew, of course, that this expansion would anger France, which had been Germany's traditional enemy, at least since the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. But he thought that Britain, and here's where he wrongly calculated, he thought that Britain would never send troops to the continent to stop it, because of course, the Brits and the Germans shared this racial affinity, right? They were the heirs of the Aryan people. So these were the core elements of Nazi philosophy, right? We got racial superiority on one hand, and the need for expansion on the other. So how exactly did Hitler come to power? Well, it was almost by accident, and it would in it could, if what happened subsequently wasn't so tragic, it would almost be humorous. Despite the impressive showing of the Nazis in the 1930 elections, they still played second fiddle to the Social Democrats. By 1932, the Nazis had become the strongest party in numeric terms in the Reichstag. That is, they controlled 230 of 611 seats. But of course, they're still far from a majority. And there was even some evidence in late 32 and early 33 that suggests that the Nazis were losing support to their arch rival on the opposite end of the political spectrum. That people were switching their allegiance from the Nazis to the communists. So it appeared in 1933, at the beginning of 33, there was some reason to be optimistic. It appeared that the Nazi phenomenon was waning. Now, ironically, the Nazi seizure of power can be attributed in part to the commitment among social democrats to the creation of a liberal bourgeois democracy. And of course, some of the values of the liberal bourgeois democracy are freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. So the German chancellor tried to convince the German president, a man named Paul von Hindenburg, to ban both the Nazi and the Communist parties at the end of 1932. But Hindenburg wouldn't do this because he thought it violated this essential freedom that all German citizens had, regardless of how odious their political beliefs might be. Because, of course, even the Nazis have freedom of assembly and freedom of speech. But clearly, Hindenburg realized that something had to be done about the Nazis. And the solution seemed ingenious at the time, but in retrospect, it's one of the great mistakes of all time. And that is, Hindenburg offered Hitler the chancellorship. That is, Hitler would preside over the Reichstag. As chancellor, Hitler would rule a coalition cabinet that would contain only 3 Nazis among its 11 cabinet members. Now, in the eyes of Hindenburg and others, once in power, Hitler would have to tone down his rhetoric and act more responsibly. Right? And this does seem to happen a lot. When people are running for office, they say crazy things. Once they're in power, they act more responsibly. But Hindenburg, it appears, even thought that once Hitler was in power, he would be little more than a puppet who could be easily controlled. And I have another picture here. And here you see Hitler joining the government, Hitler becoming chancellor, and he's sitting there in the bottom row on the right side of the screen. Now, once he was in power, Hitler moved quickly to consolidate his position. He immediately demanded that new elections to the Reichstag be called in March 1933, and this was his prerogative as chancellor. But on February 27, 1933, the Reichstag building burnt down. And we know now that the fire was probably set by a Nazi arsonist, but Hitler blamed the communists. And by noon of the following day, February 28th, 4,000 communists had been rounded up and arrested. And Hindenburg, the president, had signed an emergency decree which suspended individual liberties. In the ensuing days, Nazi thugs terrorized their political opponents, and this set the stage for a Nazi electoral triumph on March 5th, 1933. The Nazis won 44% of the seats in the Reichstag. Less than 3 weeks later, the Reichstag approved the Enabling Act, which authorized the government to rule by decree for 4 years, and then the Enabling Act would have to be renewed. So Hitler, in other words, had become a dictator, even though he never won a majority in the Reichstag. And so he got the 44%. He did have allies in other parties, and his chief allies were in a party called the Nationalist Party. National or Nationalist? Nationalist Party. So that got him over the 50% threshold. Now, Two factors made the Nazi expansion so rapid. First, the Nazis relied on the work of the Gestapo, the secret police. And second, thousands of bureaucrats and state officials joined the Nazi Party in order to advance their careers. They were opportunistic. Now, the traditional institution that was most likely to give Hitler trouble was the army. And it is clear that the leading generals in the army basically thought Hitler was a nut, and they had little respect or tolerance for him. But of course, military support was essential for this aggressive foreign policy that Hitler was going to advocate. So to quell military opposition, Hitler accused several leading figures in the military of homosexuality and ordered their assassinations. These assassinations were carried out on the night of June 30, 1934, an event that has become known as the Night of Long Knives. The Night of Long Knives. When Hindenburg died of natural causes 5 weeks later, in August of 1934, Hitler combined the offices of Chancellor and President. Now, effective opposition to the Nazis might also have come from the Christian churches in Germany. It's pretty clear if you look at who's voting for the Nazis in these elections in the early 1930s. They're drawing most of their support from middle-class Protestant voters. Nonetheless, most Protestant clergymen tried to remain politically neutral, or in some cases, to organize an active opposition to the Nazis. And about 800 Protestant clergymen perished in the concentration camps under the Nazis. And of course, the most famous of these is a man who becomes really the great German hero of the 20th century after the war, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the Protestant theologian. In 1933, Hitler signed a treaty with the Vatican in which Pope Pius XI gave his stamp of approval to the Nazi regime in return for the recognition of the traditional confessional liberties that German Catholics had enjoyed in Germany. And one of the upshots of this pact was that it undermined the ability of the Catholic Center Party, a party that is a party, the center of the political spectrum, that drew its support from Catholic voters in Germany. It undermined the ability of that party to oppose the Nazis. And whatever the case, Hitler's assurances to the Vatican proved to be worthless. In the mid-1930s, the Nazis ruthlessly attacked Catholic schools and Catholic youth groups. Eventually, Pope Pius decides that his 1933 treaty was a mistake. He does this in 1937 in a papal encyclical called With Burning Sorrow. But by the time he does this, Nazism was firmly entrenched. And in this encyclical, he attacks not Nazi racism and anti-Semitism, but totalitarianism in general. So he had in mind not only Nazi Germany, but also the Soviet Union. Now, what does this mean? Pope Pius was more hesitant. What does it mean that he was hesitant to attack Nazi anti-Semitism? Well, some historians argue that at best he turned a blind eye to the suffering of millions and millions of European Jews. Other historians have argued that Pope Pius XI was complicit in the Holocaust, and that he actively abetted it by refusing to denounce anti-Semitism among Catholics. Now, Nazi racism was directed primarily against the Jews. In 1933, after coming to power, Hitler expelled most Jews from state administrative positions. 2 years later, the infamous Nuremberg laws denied German citizenship to persons with 2 or more Jewish grandparents. So that becomes the official legal definition of Jewishness. It prohibited marriage and sexual intercourse between Germans and Jews. It required Jews to wear a yellow Star of David in public. German towns could refuse residency to Jews, and German businesses were forced to fire their Jewish employees. Now, by 1938, about 100,000 German Jews had fled abroad. And if they were prescient, they fled to Switzerland or the States or far east in the Soviet Union. But on November 8th of that year, November 8th, 1938, Nazi terrorists subjected those Jews who remained to Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. And I have some photos here. Scores of Jews were killed, thousands were dragged from their homes and beaten in the streets. 200 synagogues were burned down, 7,000 Jewish businesses were destroyed. Paradoxically, Hitler's government blamed German Jews for the disturbances. Thought of them much like rowdy soccer fans. And 25,000 Jews were incarcerated in concentration camps as a result of Kristallnacht, which they had allegedly perpetrated on their own. Now, these early attacks on Jews were part of what we can call the disemancipation phase of Nazi policy, right? Disemancipation, it means taking away of rights, right, from Jews. What made the Nazi program so unique was their subsequent attempt to annihilate European Jews through a very methodical genocide. Now, Hitler wanted Lebensraum in the East, and according to his aide Heinrich Himmler, this would require the annihilation of 30 million Slavs, whom, of course, the Nazis regarded as subhuman. To this end, Hitler authorized special SS action teams to slaughter at will in the Soviet Union, and these action teams were called the Einsatzgruppen. And these units typically forced their victims, many of whom were Jews or communists, to dig mass graves, and then they were lined up on the rim of the grave to be shot. Millions of Soviet citizens died in this manner. Some 3.7 million Soviet prisoners of war were executed in this manner. September, somebody said it.
First.
September, like 1938?
No, September 1, 1939. So soon after the beginning of the war in 1939, Jews in Poland were herded into ghettos, first into the city of Lodz and then in Warsaw and other cities. It was from the ghettos that Jews were sent to be killed in the concentration camps, but the ghettos were hardly any picnic themselves. By 1942, the death rates in these Polish ghettos was approaching 20% per year. So the ghettos were pretty efficient at killing as well. And the ghettos were meant to be a temporary expedient, right, whereby Jews could be isolated from the rest of the human community while their ultimate fate was determined. In July of 1941, Hermann Göring, at Hitler's command, issued the fateful order for the mass murder of Jews. And in the order, it was phrased as, quote, a total solution to the Jewish question in the German sphere of influence in Europe. The following January of 1942, Nazi leaders met in a picturesque Berlin suburb right by a lake in Wannsee to map out plans to deport Jews to camps specially equipped to exterminate large numbers of people in as efficient a manner as possible. And the Nazis decided that execution by machine gun was too slow and too costly. The preferred method was the gas chamber. And the gas chamber had several advantages. Post-mortem, dental fillings, anything of value could be removed from the corpses before they were sent to the crematoria. Bones and ashes could be turned into fertilizer. Some corpses were boiled to produce soap. The most notorious of these camps was at Auschwitz in Poland, right outside of Krakow. Auschwitz was a model of German efficiency. See, I'm attributing to Germans an essential characteristic. They are efficient. Auschwitz was capable of killing 1,200 persons per day. sign was, yeah, but they found it, right, yeah. By the end of the war, Auschwitz alone was responsible for the murder of 2.5 million people in gas chambers and 500,000 more by simple barbaric treatment. There's another photo of Auschwitz. The Nazis planned to exterminate inferior peoples, also included gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and mentally ill. Between 1938 and 1941, the Nazis perfected their gassing technique on 70,000 mentally ill Germans. German scientists perfected this form of cyanide that aerates when it comes into contact with oxygen. It's called Zyklon B. But even at its most efficient, gassing took between 15 and 20 minutes to kill most of its victims. Now, by 1942 and 1943, reports started to make their way out of Europe, across the lines to the Western powers and into the Soviet Union. And at first, Allied and Jewish leaders were incredulous at these reports of genocide. It just seemed too barbaric to be true. But even when these reports were confirmed, no efforts were made to bomb either the camps or the railroad lines leading to the camps. There were episodes of heroism. Underground church groups, mostly Protestant, assisted Jews. Unfortunately, Pope Pius XI's successor, a man named Pope Pius XII, never condemned the atrocities, even when Jews were herded into cattle cars in Rome itself for deportation to the death camps. There was scant sympathy for Jews in Poland, especially among a Roman Catholic clergy that was bitterly anti-Semitic. There were, as I said, instances of heroism. The Danes, the Hungarians, the Bulgarians, and the Italians organized large underground resistance networks that saved tens of thousands of Jews from murder. In fact, this is what Professor Goodman has written about, the Danish resistance. But efforts to blame the slaughter on a handful of deranged Nazis are really indefensible. Approximately 50,000 people were directly involved in the final solution. This included German soldiers, French collaborationists, Polish Roman Catholic clergy, so on and so on and so on. And few of these people were ever held responsible for their crimes. Okay, so I said that I would conclude then with some thoughts about how historians have tried to make sense of the Holocaust. And for several decades, debate on the Holocaust centered on two schools of thought. And these schools of thought had very unsexy names. They were called the intentionalists and the functionalists. So what were they? Well, the intentionalists argued that the Holocaust was a product of Nazi willfulness. Okay, so in other words, if you wanted to find where the roots of the Holocaust lay, you looked at the origins of the Nazi Party, right? You would look in Hitler's Mein Kampf, the Nuremberg laws, so on and so on. So in other words, the Nazis had a plan, or Hitler was a man with a plan, and once he was in power, he acted on that plan. Okay? Now, then we have the functionalists. And the functionalists argue that there was no master plan to eradicate Jews, although they do recognize that there was deep anti-Semitism among Nazis and even among German society as a whole. They argue instead that the Holocaust was the product of a specific confluence of events. And I think one way you can envision this is imagine an hourglass turned on its side, right, and then laid down next to a timeline. And the moment that the Holocaust began is where those sands of time come together, where these events, these different factors intersect with each other. And these people, the functionalists, tend to emphasize rivalries within the bureaucracy. Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem is an important book for the functionalists, rather than the ambitions of political leaders like Adolf Hitler. Now, more recently, there has been a tendency to look beyond this divide, beyond the intentionalist and functionalist divide. And scholars like Christopher Browning at the University of North Carolina, Goldhagen, I don't know where he is anymore, he used to be at Harvard, they have tried to ascertain the individual motivations of persons who participated in killing. Jan Gross, whom I've already referred to, this author of this really stellar book about this village in Poland, Jedwabne, has even go so far as to question the centrality of German soldiers in the Holocaust. So the Holocaust that he chronicles is a Holocaust that is perpetrated by Poles, not by Germans. And then my favorite is the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman, whom I've also mentioned. And Bauman places the Holocaust within the broader trajectories of modernization and Enlightenment thought. In particular, Bauman has coined this phrase, the weeding state, or the gardening state. And he says that all modern states are gardening states. That is, they try to cultivate their populations, right? And we do this by subsidizing the cost of your education, right? By saying if you serve in the military, you can go to university for free, by making it possible for poor people to pay a smaller percentage of their income in taxes. So that's a way that populations are gardened. Well, Bauman argues that the Holocaust was a perverse variation on the gardening state, right? Because Jews were identified as the weeds, and they needed to be extracted from the ground. But nonetheless, it's two sides of the same coin. Okay, well, believe it or not, I'm done, and I don't know why this talk, which every other year has taken an hour and a half, has only taken an hour and 15 minutes this year. But I am done, so I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
You're talking faster.
Really? I think I was afraid I was going to fall over if I stepped back, so I didn't gesticulate widely. Yeah.
Can you go back into detail about militarism, the definition I didn't understand?
Militarism, yeah. So what did you pick up about what I talked about militarism? What is it? Oh, we have a couple different components of militarism, right? We have the fact that all the major powers are maintaining standing armies. That's a new thing, right? It used to be armies existed only in times of war. Once the war was over, people went home. But now armies exist in peacetime as well. We have these technological advancements, the machine gun, the dreadnought, artillery pieces, chemical weapons, right? We have increasing sums of money being spent on the military across the European continent, from Russia in the east to Great Britain in the west. And then I think most importantly is just this notion, the idea that violence has become culturally acceptable among persons of all political stripes. So violence becomes an acceptable means of politics. Okay? Any other questions?
Sorry, there's one more.
Oh, go ahead.
When you were talking about the Nazi expansion, you said there was the major influence or major, I don't know what to say, but there was the Gestapo and what was the other?
Oh, and then the careerists, right? We have the secret police, that's the stick, right? And then the carrot, these people who join the Nazi party because they realize it's good for their career. And the opportunists. Yeah.
There have been sociologists who study the records of the Nazi Party, and the overwhelming majority of members of the Nazi Party joined after January 30th, 1945.
facilitated the Holocaust, and I'm just wondering why you left out, or maybe chose not to put in hyperinflation and the economic crisis as a direct link to the Holocaust. Or...
Yeah, well, that's the privilege of a historian, right? I get to prioritize. But you're right. I think if you read between the lines of what I said, clearly I also think that the economic context is significant, right? Because I mentioned the American crash in '29, right? The fact that financiers weren't able to extend loans anymore to Weimar, and that seems to me. I guess one way to think about this is there's a long chronology, right, and then there's a short chronology. In the long chronology are the structural characteristics I mentioned, right? It's anti-Semitism, it's nationalism, and it's militarism. The short chronology is the specific event history that leads to the Nazi triumph in 1933. Sure.
I think you can argue that the economic conditions, at least same economic conditions, did not persist. That they may have been a catalyst of sorts, but they did not persist because the Germans worked seriously against their own economic interests by murdering populations that they could have used the slave labor. And they used materials to do that. So it might have been a catalyst, but I don't see it as a persistent ism that contributed to the Holocaust.
Any other questions? I fear I have put you all to sleep. Yeah. What's your name? Brennan.
What's the name of your book on Khrushchev?
Ah, good question. It's called The Many Lives of Khrushchev's Thaw. If you buy a copy, I will sign it, thereby detracting from its resale value. But you do put 70 cents in your pocket.
It may be helpful to clarify why there was a kind of scapegoating of the Jews in terms of the issue of reparations and the end of World War I, and the sense that they had somehow or other betrayed the German government. I think you came close when you're talking about nationalism and we as a club belong to this country and
Okay, so here you will have to help me, but if I'm not mistaken, the German politician who signed Versailles was a Jew, right? What was his name? So this is a really, I mentioned that I think that the specific issue of reparations, we may overstate how important that is. More important is, in my mind, is the fact that the new civilian leadership of Weimar was saddled with defeat, the shame of defeat, right? In World War I ends in a very peculiar way. It's really not quite the case that the German military lost the war. It's really the case that the German home front just got tired of fighting the war, right? In fact, until the Americans arrived, Americans entered the war in 1917, but it's really not until 1918 that American soldiers begin to arrive in Europe. Things look pretty bleak for the Allies because the Bolsheviks had taken Russia out of the war. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is signed in March of 1918. And so what had been a two-front war becomes a one-front war for Germany. But nonetheless, by the summer of 1918, the German economy begins to stall, right? It's like this car, this jalopy that's overheating, right? And you try to turn down you press the accelerator, but you have to turn down the air conditioner. And that makes people uncomfortable, right? And so people on the home front begin to rebel. And so among German soldiers, there's a sense of betrayal. Right? They were betrayed in the war. They weren't defeated, they were betrayed by the home front. And it just becomes easy for a myriad of reasons to blame Jews principally for that betrayal. And the fact that this Jewish politician oh God. Walter Rathenau. Walter Rathenau. The fact that Walter Rathenau, a very prominent Jewish politician in Weimar, signs Versailles, strikes the German nationalists as entirely idiots. Any other questions? Yeah. What kind of report? Well, Europe at war is not, that the Axis was not this hermetically sealed vessel. There was movement across the frontier. And there were even people, in rare instances, who escaped from concentration camps. In fact, I came across not very long ago an account of a Hungarian who escaped from Auschwitz and went back to Budapest and tried to explain what was going on, and people were, just couldn't believe it. So these reports do begin to filter out, and of course we knew that the Nazis had a penchant for anti-Semitism, but there's still a pretty big leap from anti-Semitism to genocide, I think, and that's what people had a hard time swallowing. And then, of course, as the war really turns at the end of 1942 with Battle of Stalingrad, and at that point, the Red Army begins its long march, its long slog west. And as they liberate territories in Ukraine and Belarus, it became evident what the Nazis had wrought. And these territories that had been the epicenter of European Jewish life for hundreds and hundreds of years were completely devoid of Jews. In fact, the great Soviet writer Ilya Ehrenberg wrote an essay called Ukraina без Евреев, Ukraine without Jews.
There was no cable news network.
Yeah. Any other questions? I actually like talking longer because then I don't have to take questions. Okay, well, I hope I didn't bore you, and I'll see you.